A 62-year-old woman stood in a lawyer's office in Ithaca, New York, and learned that her grandmother had left her brother nearly $4 million and left her a crumbling farm that hadn't seen a living soul in over a decade. Her cousins exchanged looks. Her brother adjusted his tie and said nothing. Everyone in that room believed Margaret Lennox had received the worst inheritance in the family's history. But what none of them knew, what even Margaret herself would not discover for weeks, was that beneath the rotting floorboards and the overgrown fields of that forgotten property, her grandmother had buried a secret worth more than everything else combined. Before we go any further, if you enjoy stories about families, hidden legacies, and the kind of quiet courage that changes everything, consider subscribing. We share new stories every week, and each one is made for evenings like this. Now let's continue. The morning Hattie Lennox was buried, the sky over Ithaca hung low and pale, the kind of November gray that doesn't promise rain, but doesn't promise anything else either. The maple trees lining the cemetery had already lost their color. Their bare branches reached upward like hands opened in surrender, and the wind that moved between them carried the smell of cold earth and damp stone. Margaret stood near the back of the gathering. She wore a dark coat that was slightly too large for her. It had been her mother's years ago before her mother passed, and she held her hands together in front of her the way she always did when she didn't know what to do with them. She was 62, retired, a former school nurse who had spent 31 years applying bandages, checking fevers, and sitting with children who cried for reasons they couldn't explain. She had never married. She had lived alone in a small apartment in Syracuse for the past 9 years, and the truth was that Hattie had been the person she spoke to most often on the phone every Sunday evening, without exception, for as long as she could remember. Now the phone would not ring on Sunday. A few rows ahead, her younger brother Franklin stood with his wife and their 2 grown sons. Frank was 58 and looked exactly the way a man looks when he has spent 3 decades making sure other people notice him. His suit was tailored, his shoes were polished, his posture carried the particular confidence of someone who had always believed that success was something you could measure in square footage and quarterly returns. He worked in commercial real estate in Albany, and he had done well enough to own 2 homes lease, a German sedan, and speak about money with the casual ease of a person who had never truly been without it. They had not been close in years, not because of any single argument, but because the distance between their lives had grown so wide that neither of them knew how to cross it anymore. Frank called on holidays. Margaret sent birthday cards. That was the shape of it. After the service, the family gathered at a law office on State Street. The room was paneled in dark wood and smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. 14 people sat in chairs arranged in a loose semicircle, cousins and aunt, a few of Hattie's oldest friends. Everyone waited. The attorney was a man named Aldrich, mid-60s. With reading glasses, he kept removing and replacing, as though he couldn't decide whether seeing clearly was worth the trouble. He opened a leather folder and began. First came the smaller bequests, a donation to the local historical society, a sum set aside for the church where Hattie had volunteered for decades, a modest gift to a woman named Beulah who had helped care for Hattie during her final year. None of this surprised anyone. Hattie had always been generous in ways that were precise. Rather than grand, she gave where she believed it mattered, and she never gave carelessly. Then Aldrich turned to the primary estate. He adjusted his glasses one final time and read aloud. Franklin Lennox would receive the 3 rental properties in Albany and Rochester. He would receive the investment accounts held at 2 separate institutions. He would receive the savings, the certificates of deposit, and the portfolio of municipal bonds that Hattie had quietly accumulated over 40 years. The total value before taxes exceeded $3.8 million. The room shifted, not dramatically, no one gasped or applauded, but the quality of the silence changed the way a room changes when someone opens a window. Margaret could feel people recalculating. She could feel them looking at Frank with a new kind of attention, the kind that attaches itself to proximity and money and does not let go easily. Frank kept his expression steady, but his right hand moved to his knee, and his fingers pressed once against the fabric of his trousers. Margaret noticed. She had spent 3 decades watching small gestures in children, the way a boy tugs his ear before he lies, the way a girl twists her sleeve when she is afraid. She knew what it looked like when someone was trying very hard not to smile. Then Aldrich said her name. Margaret Lennox would receive as sole and exclusive heir a property of approximately 190 acres located in the township of Ovid, Seneca County, New York, including all structures, contents, and land rights therein. Nothing else. The silence returned. This time it was different. It was not expectation. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room when people are unsure whether to feel sorry for someone or simply relieved that the misfortune belongs to somebody else. A cousin named Dale leaned toward his wife and whispered something. Margaret didn't hear the words, but she saw the wife glance at her and then look away. An aunt seated near the window, Aunt Peg, who had always spoken as though volume were a form of honesty, said it aloud before anyone else had the nerve. "That old place hasn't been touched in years. She'll be lucky to give it away." No one disagreed. After the reading, people stood and moved in small groups toward the hallway. Coffee appeared. Conversations resumed. Margaret remained in her chair for a long moment, holding the envelope Aldrich had given her, a copy of the deed of property survey, a few pages of tax records. She turned the envelope over in her hands without opening it. Frank approached. He stood in front of her, with his hands in his pockets, and for a brief moment she thought he might say something kind, something that acknowledged what had just happened. Instead, his voice came easy, almost cheerful. "Don't worry about it, Maggie. That land's probably worth something to a developer. You could have it listed by spring." She looked up at him. There was nothing cruel in his face. He genuinely believed he was being helpful. That was the part that stung, not the advice itself, but the absolute certainty behind it, as though the only possible response to inheriting something difficult was to get rid of it as fast as you could. The drive back to Syracuse took 2 hours. Margaret spent most of it in silence, the radio of the highway unspooling in front of her like a sentence she couldn't finish. When she arrived home, she placed the envelope on her kitchen table beside a framed photograph of Hattie, one taken years ago in a garden with sunlight catching the white of her hair. In the photograph, Hattie was smiling, but not at the camera. She was looking at something beyond the frame, something only she could see. Margaret sat across from that photograph for a long time. Nothing about the will made sense. Hattie had been deliberate in everything she did. She planned meals a week in advance. She balanced her checkbook by hand every month until the year she died. She did not make decisions out of carelessness, and she did not make them out of spite. So why had she divided the inheritance so unevenly? Why had she given Frank everything that could be measured in dollars and given Margaret a property that by every account was falling apart? The days that followed were difficult in the way that grief is always difficult, not as a single blow, but as a series of small reminders that arrive without warning. A song on the radio that Hattie had loved, a brand of tea on the grocery shelf, the silence of Sunday evening. The family's opinion was unanimous. Sell the farm. Every phone call, every text message, every conversation at the post-funeral gathering carried the same advice. Some delivered it gently. Others were blunt. A cousin told her she'd be foolish to keep it. Aunt Peg said it was probably full of mold and raccoons and unpaid taxes, and that hanging on to it would only drag her down. But something strange happened inside Margaret's chest each time she heard those words. Instead of agreement, she felt resistance, quiet, stubborn, almost physical, like a door being pushed shut from the inside. One evening her friend June called. June Calloway had known Margaret since elementary school. They had grown up 4 blocks apart in a neighborhood that no longer existed, and they had maintained the kind of friendship that does not require frequent contact to remain strong. June listened to the whole story, the will, the reactions, the pressure to sell, and then she asked a single question. "Have you actually been there yet?" Margaret paused. June's voice was calm. "Then you don't really know what you inherited, do you?" That question stayed with her through the night and into the next morning. She woke early, packed a small bag, placed the envelope from the lawyer on the passenger seat of her car, and drove south. The property was nearly 3 hours from Syracuse. The route took her through small towns whose main streets had been hollowed out by decades of slow departure, shuttered storefronts, faded awnings, churches with parking lots larger than their congregations. The farther she drove, the quieter the world became. Strip malls gave way to open fields. The hills of the Finger Lakes region rose around her in long, gentle waves, their slopes bare and brown in the late autumn light. She found the access road just past a gas station that looked like it hadn't changed since 1974. A rusted sign leaned at an angle near the turn. The letters had been eaten by weather, but she could still make out the word Lennox. The road was unpaved. Gravel popped beneath her tires. On either side the land opened wide fields that had once been cultivated, now thick with goldenrod and milkweed gone to seed. In the distance she could see a line of trees marking the edge of a gorge, and beyond that the silver surface of one of the smaller lakes catching the late morning sun. Then the house appeared. It had been white once. She could tell by the few patches of paint that still clung to the clapboard siding like old bandages refusing to fall. The porch sagged on one end. Two of the front windows were broken, and someone had nailed plywood over them from the inside. The roof showed patches of bare wood where shingles had torn away, and along the foundation weeds had grown so high they nearly reached the window sills. Margaret turned off the engine and sat in the car for a full minute before stepping out. The silence was enormous. No machinery, no voices, no animals. Only the wind moving through the dry grass with a sound like someone slowly turning the pages of a very old book. She walked to the front door. The knob was stiff, but turned. The door swung inward with a groan, and the smell hit her immediately, damp wood dust, the faint sweetness of decay. Inside, everything was coated in a fine grey layer, as though the house had been slowly exhaling for years, and this was what remained. The furniture was still in place. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, a sofa with cushions that had collapsed under their own weight, a bookshelf filled with volumes whose spines had faded to uniform beige. On the walls, framed photographs hung at slight angles, images of the farm in better days, workers standing beside tractors, a harvest celebration with long tables set outdoors, green fields stretching toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. Margaret moved through the rooms, slowly touching nothing at first. Each doorway felt like a threshold between the present and some earlier version of the world, a version where this house had been alive. On the second floor she found 3 bedrooms and a small study. The study contained a wooden desk, a filing cabinet with 1 drawer missing, and a window that looked out over the back of the property. From there, she could see the remains of several outbuildings, barns, storage sheds, a long concrete structure that might have been a dairy facility decades ago. All of it weathered, all of it waiting. In the largest bedroom, she noticed something. A heavy wardrobe made of dark wood stood against the far wall. It was the kind of furniture that belonged to another century, carved legs, brass handles, worn smooth by generations of hands. But it was not flush against the wall. The gap was small, no more than a few inches, but it was there. In a house where everything else seemed frozen in place, that slight displacement felt deliberate. Margaret braced her shoulder against the side of the wardrobe and pushed. It moved reluctantly, with a deep groan from the floorboards beneath, and revealed a section of wall that was different from the rest. There was a small door barely 3 feet high, set into the plaster. It had no visible lock, only a simple iron latch darkened with age. Her pulse quickened. She knelt, lifted the latch, and pulled. The door resisted, then gave way with a dry crack. A breath of stale air escaped from the opening, carrying the smell of old paper and something faintly metallic. Behind the door was a shallow compartment built into the wall, not a room, but a space clearly designed to hold something important. Inside, she found a wooden box, carefully placed at the center, surrounded by cloth-wrapped bundles, and a small oil lamp thick with dust. She lifted the box. It was not locked. She opened it. Inside, arranged in perfect order, were 7 envelopes. Every one of them bore the same handwriting on the front, Hattie's handwriting, that mixture of cursive and print that Margaret had known her entire life, and every one of them was addressed to the same person. Margaret, not Frank, not the family, not the attorney, her. She sat on the edge of the bed with the first envelope in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter inside was written on plain white paper, undated, and it began without preamble. Hattie's voice came through the words as clearly as if she were sitting in the room. "My dear girl, if you are reading this, then you did what I believed you would do. You came here. You did not sell. You did not listen to the ones who told you this place was worthless. And now I need you to trust me a little longer." The letter continued. Hattie explained that the farm was not what anyone believed it to be. She did not say what it was not yet, but she made one thing unmistakably clear. Margaret must not sell the property. Not until she had discovered everything that was hidden here. The final lines made her breath catch. What you're looking for isn't where anyone thinks to look first. The roots run deeper than anyone remembers. Tucked beneath the last envelope, wrapped in a square of linen, was an object that Margaret almost missed. She unfolded the cloth and found a key, hand-forged iron, heavy for its size, its surface dark and rough in a way that suggested it had been made not in a factory, but by someone who understood fire and metal. It was old, it was beautiful in the way that only useful things can be beautiful, and it fit nothing she had seen in the house. She held it in her palm and felt its weight settle against her skin. The second letter was more specific. It mentioned an old storehouse at the northern edge of the property and instructed her to find a mark carved into a stone wall, a star. If she found the star, she would know where to look next. Margaret read both letters twice. Then she placed them carefully back in the box, put the iron key in her coat pocket, and went downstairs. There were still a few hours of daylight left. She remembered passing a stone structure during her walk around the property, squat, partially collapsed, half swallowed by vines. It had looked like nothing. She had barely glanced at it. The walk took longer than expected. The path was overgrown, and in several places she had to push through brush that hadn't been cleared in years. The late afternoon sun threw long shadows across the ground, and the air grew colder as she moved farther from the house. The storehouse appeared around the base of a low hill. Its walls were rough-cut limestone, the kind quarried locally a century ago. The wooden door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, the space was cluttered with rusted tools, broken crates, and the remnants of shelving that had collapsed under the weight of years. Margaret searched. She moved along the walls, running her hands over the stone, brushing away dirt and moss. For nearly 40 minutes she found nothing. Her knees ached. Her fingers were raw. She was on the verge of leaving when she noticed, low on the western wall, a stone that was slightly different from the others, smoother, more deliberately placed. She knelt and wiped the surface with her sleeve, a 5-pointed star cut cleanly into the rock. Beneath it, a date, 1989. Her breath stopped for a moment. She had never heard Hattie mention that year. She had never heard anyone in the family speak of it. She pressed the stone. Nothing happened. She examined the ones around it and found a hairline gap along the edge of an adjacent block. She pushed. A faint click echoed through the empty building, and a section of the floor, a wooden panel she had been standing on moments earlier, shifted upward by half an inch. Margaret stared. Then she dropped to her knees and lifted the panel with both hands. Beneath it, nestled in a shallow concrete cavity lined with waterproof sheeting, was a metal cylinder, the kind used to protect documents from moisture and fire. She unscrewed the cap and slid out the contents. Papers, dozens of them tightly rolled, held together with rubber bands that crumbled at her touch. She spread them across the floor of the storehouse one by one, using stones to hold down the corners. What she found was not a letter. It was not a personal note or a family record. It was something far larger. There were soil analyses conducted by agricultural engineers, hydrological surveys of the surrounding watershed, economic projections for regional development, architectural blueprints for buildings she had never seen, partnership agreements signed by Hattie and individuals whose names she did not recognize, and at the top of every document the same heading appeared in clean professional type: the Cornerstone Initiative. Margaret sat back on her heels. She had never heard the name. Not once in 62 years of knowing her grandmother had Hattie ever mentioned a project of any kind connected to the farm. The family had always treated this property as an afterthought, a piece of rural acreage that produced nothing, cost money in taxes, and existed mainly as an obligation nobody wanted. But these documents told a different story. They told the story of a woman who had spent decades quietly, methodically, in secret, building a plan to transform this land and the communities around it into something extraordinary: employment programs, agricultural development, infrastructure for families who had been left behind by every economic shift of the past half-century, training centers, cooperative markets, a network of support designed not for profit, but for permanence. Margaret's hands were shaking. Not from cold, she gathered everything carefully, rolled the papers back into the cylinder, and carried it against her chest as she walked back to the house in the fading light. The fields around her were dark now, and the first stars had begun to appear above the ridge. That night she sat at the kitchen table of the old farmhouse, with the documents spread around her and the iron key resting beside the oil lamp she had cleaned and lit. She picked up her phone and called Frank. He answered on the second ring. His voice carried the easy warmth of a man who has had a good dinner and expects nothing complicated from the evening. She told him what she had found. She described the hidden compartment, the letters, the storehouse, the documents. She tried to explain the scope of what Hattie had built in secret. There was a pause. Then Frank's voice came back lighter now, almost amused. Maggie, it's a bunch of old paperwork. Grandma liked to keep things. That doesn't make it valuable. You know what I'd do? I'd call a realtor Monday morning and have that place listed before the first snow. She said nothing. His tone softened just slightly, the way a person softens when they believe they are being patient with someone who doesn't quite understand. Look, I know you loved her. We all did. But sometimes things are exactly what they look like. A farm is a farm. Sell it and move on. Margaret sat in the quiet after the call ended. The lamp flickered. The iron key caught the light. Its surface dark and uneven, forged by a hand she would never know. She looked at the documents. She looked at Hattie's handwriting on the envelope nearest to her, that familiar, careful script that had addressed birthday cards and grocery lists, and apparently the plans for something no one in the family had ever been allowed to see. Then she looked out the window. The darkness was complete. Somewhere beyond the glass 190 acres of land stretched out in every direction, silent, overgrown, dismissed by everyone who had ever glanced at it. Everyone except the woman who had spent a lifetime protecting it. Margaret placed her hand over the iron key and felt its weight again, solid, patient waiting. She was not going to sell. She did not yet know what the key opened. She did not yet understand why Hattie had hidden so much for so long. She did not know who else might be looking for what she had found, or what it would cost her to keep looking. But for the first time since the reading of the will, something had shifted inside her chest. Not grief, not confusion, but a feeling she had almost forgotten. The feeling of standing at the edge of something that mattered, something that required her specifically, something that would not wait. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, and the land lay still beneath the November sky, holding its secrets the way it had always held them, patiently, deeply in the dark spaces where no one thought to look. She did not sleep well that first night in the farmhouse. The bed in the upstairs room was old, and the mattress had long since lost whatever shape it once held. But it was not discomfort that kept her awake. It was the documents. They were spread across the kitchen table below her, held flat by coffee mugs and stones she had gathered from the yard, and even with her eyes closed she could feel them there waiting, the way Hattie herself must have waited year after year for someone to finally come looking. By dawn she had given up on rest. She made coffee using a camp stove she had brought from the car and sat at the table while the first gray light crept through the kitchen window. The Cornerstone Initiative papers surrounded her like the fragments of a conversation interrupted decades ago. She tried to organize them: soil studies in one pile, financial projections in another, partnership agreements in a third. But the task was overwhelming. Some pages referenced appendices that were missing. Others mentioned individuals she had never heard of. Several contracts trailed off mid-paragraph, as though someone had pulled the remaining pages from the stack. She spent the morning trying to read everything in sequence and failed. The technical language defeated her. Hydrological capacity, nutrient load mapping, cooperative yield structures. She understood the broad strokes. Hattie had planned something enormous, but the specifics blurred together until her eyes ached and her confidence faltered. By noon she had accomplished almost nothing. She sat back in the chair and pressed her palms against her face. For the first time since arriving, she heard Aunt Peg's voice in her memory, sharp, certain, not unkind, but not gentle either. And she wondered whether the old woman had been right after all. Maybe this was too much. Maybe a retired school nurse with no experience in agriculture or development or finance had no business sitting alone in a collapsing farmhouse trying to decode the secret life's work of a woman who had clearly been operating on a level none of them had ever understood. The iron key sat on the table beside her coffee mug. She picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, and set it down again. Then she got in her car and drove to town. Ovid was 12 minutes east along a road that followed the curve of the lake. It was the kind of place that had once been prosperous enough to support a hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner, and a post office, and was now prosperous enough to support the post office. Half the storefronts on Main Street were dark. A banner advertising a summer festival from 3 years ago still hung across the front of the old theater, its colors bleached to whispers by sun and rain. But at the far end of the block, past a barber shop that appeared to open only on Tuesdays, she found a small cafe with a hand-painted sign that read Callaway's. June had mentioned it once, her sister-in-law's place or her cousin's. Margaret could not remember which. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was warm and smelled of bacon grease and wood smoke. 4 tables, a short counter, a chalkboard menu that listed 7 items. 2 men in work jackets sat near the window eating eggs. A woman behind the counter looked up and nodded, but did not speak. Margaret ordered coffee and toast and sat near the back. She was not sure what she was looking for. Information, perhaps. Context. Someone who could explain what Hattie had been doing on that property for 30 years without anyone knowing. She did not have to wait long. The older of the 2 men near the window turned in his chair and studied her with the unhurried attention of someone who had lived in a small town long enough to recognize every face and notice every new one. He was tall even while seated, with a narrow frame and hands that were large and spotted with age. His hair was white and cut close to the scalp, and his eyes pale blue, remarkably clear for a man who appeared to be well past 80, held a quality of stillness that made Margaret feel inexplicably that she had been expected. His voice carried across the room, without effort, low and steady, the kind of voice that does not need volume to command attention, your Hattie's girl. It was not a question. Margaret set down her coffee. She told him her name. She asked how he knew. The man's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something that lived in the lines around his eyes rather than his mouth. His answer came quietly, almost to himself. She always said you'd come. Just didn't know if it would be soon enough. His name was Ellis Cartwright. He was 83 years old. He had been an agricultural engineer for the County Extension Service for 4 decades before retiring, and he had worked with Hattie Lennox on the Cornerstone Initiative from the very beginning. They talked for 2 hours. Ellis did not overwhelm her. He did not lecture or perform or try to impress her with the scope of what he knew. He answered her questions one at a time, and when she did not ask the right questions, he waited. He let her find her way. What emerged slowly was a picture of her grandmother that Margaret had never seen. Hattie had begun the Cornerstone project in the late 1980s, shortly after a series of farm closures devastated the region. She had watched families lose their land, their income, their reason for staying. She had watched young people leave for cities they could not afford and jobs that did not want them. And she had decided quietly, without announcement, without permission, to build something that could stop the bleeding. She had recruited engineers, agronomists, economists. She had funded soil studies and water surveys out of her own savings. She had traveled to universities and extension offices and cooperative associations across 3 states, gathering knowledge and partnerships that she brought back to the farm like seeds carried in her pockets. The plan was comprehensive. Not a single crop or a single business, but an entire network of interconnected programs designed to create employment, improve yields, train families, and rebuild the economic foundation of the region from the ground up. For nearly a decade it had worked. The project had advanced through study and planning and small-scale testing. Specialists visited the farm regularly. Partnerships were formalized. A prototype training center was partially constructed. Then it stopped. Margaret leaned forward. Ellis's gaze dropped to the table. His words came more carefully now, measured, as though he were choosing each one from a shelf and examining it before placing it down. A man came in from outside. Businessman. Said he wanted to invest. Big money, big plans, big promises. Hattie was cautious, but some of the partners pushed for it. They thought the project needed capital to move forward, and this man had plenty. Margaret asked his name. Ellis paused. His fingers tapped once against the side of his coffee cup. Everett Dane. The name meant nothing to her. She said so. Ellis nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. He was smooth, polite, knew exactly what to say. For a while everything seemed fine. Then Hattie started noticing things. Documents going missing, meetings being held without her knowledge, partners being contacted behind her back. She realized Dane wasn't trying to support the project, he was trying to take it. Margaret's chest tightened. Alice continued. When she confronted him, he denied everything. When she cut him off, the lawsuits started. When the lawsuits failed, the documents disappeared. Key files, original agreements, technical studies gone. The partners scattered. Some were afraid. Some had been paid off. Within a year, the whole thing was dead. He looked at her directly. His voice dropped lower. Your grandmother spent the rest of her life protecting what was left, hiding it, making sure nobody could find it, and nobody could destroy it. She always believed someone would come back for it. She chose you. Margaret sat with those words for a long time after Alice left. The cafe had emptied. The woman behind the counter was wiping tables with a patience that suggested she did not mind if Margaret stayed all afternoon. She returned to the farm in the late afternoon and went directly to the documents. Now she knew what to look for. She searched for any mention of Everett Dane and found nothing. The name had been carefully removed from every record she possessed. But she did find something else. In a slim folder tucked between two soil surveys, there was a list of visitors to the property dated from the last 10 years of Hattie's life. Most of the names were unfamiliar agricultural technicians, a surveyor, a county official. But one entry repeated 4 times across 3 years stopped her cold. Preston Dane, access requested. Below the 4th entry in Hattie's handwriting, 2 words underlined twice, deny permanently. Margaret stared at the page. She did not know who Preston Dane was. But the last name was unmistakable, and the fact that Hattie had felt the need to explicitly and permanently ban this person from the property told her everything she needed to know about the nature of the relationship. She photographed every page in the folder with her phone and locked the originals in the metal cylinder she had retrieved from the storehouse. 2 days later, she drove 3 hours south to meet a woman named Lorraine Pruitt. The connection had come through Alice, who remembered that Hattie's closest collaborator during the early years of the project, a woman named Viola Pruitt, now deceased, had a niece still living in the area. Lorraine was 60, quiet-spoken, and visibly moved when Margaret explained who she was and why she had come. They sat in Lorraine's living room, surrounded by stacks of books and framed photographs that covered nearly every horizontal surface. Lorraine brought out a cardboard box she had kept in a closet for years, papers, clippings, and photographs that had belonged to her Aunt Viola. Margaret went through them carefully. Most were duplicates of things she had already seen, meeting notes, project summaries, correspondence. But near the bottom of the box, she found a photograph that changed everything. It showed a gathering of people seated around a long table. Margaret recognized Hattie immediately, younger, dark-haired, leaning forward with the intensity she remembered from childhood. Beside her sat Viola and 2 men she did not know. Across the table were several others, and among them, positioned near the center of the group, with an easy, confident posture, was a man in a light-colored suit. Margaret's eyes moved past him, then returned. Seated directly beside the man in the light suit, engaged in what appeared to be close conversation, was her father. She felt the floor shift beneath her. Her father, Julian Lennox, who had died 17 years ago without ever not once mentioning the Cornerstone Initiative or the farm or any project connected to Hattie in any way. Her father, who had always been quiet on the subject of the property, her father, who had changed the subject every time someone brought up Hattie's land. Lorraine noticed her expression. She leaned closer and pointed to the man in the light suit. "That's Everett Dane." Margaret could not speak. Lorraine's voice was gentle. "Viola told me there was a split. Some of the family wanted to bring in outside money. Your grandmother refused. It caused problems that lasted years. Viola never told me exactly what happened, but she said the disagreement went deeper than most people knew." Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a date 31 years ago and a single phrase before it fell apart. She drove back to the farm in silence. The countryside passed without registering. Her mind was full of her father, his quiet evenings in his armchair, his careful avoidance of certain subjects, the way he had always seemed slightly uncomfortable when Hattie's name came up at family gatherings. She had attributed it to personality. Now she understood it was guilt or shame, or something adjacent to both the particular silence of a man who had once chosen the wrong side and spent the rest of his life trying not to think about it. She arrived at the farm after dark. The house was exactly as she had left it, lamp burning low in the kitchen, documents still spread across the table, the iron key resting beside the cylinder. But something was wrong. She knew it before she opened the door. The kitchen window, the one she always latched before leaving, was dark. She had left the lamp on. She was certain of it. Margaret pushed the door open slowly. The smell of cold air hit her first, not the stale warmth of a closed house, but the sharp, wet smell of outside. She stepped into the kitchen and turned on the overhead light. The documents on the table had been disturbed. Several folders were missing. Photographs she had arranged in careful rows were scattered across the floor. The filing box where she kept the most sensitive records was open, its contents visibly reduced. And the back door, the one that led to the yard, was ajar, swinging gently in the wind that came down from the ridge. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. Someone had been here. Someone had gone through her work, taken what they wanted, and left. She checked the metal cylinder. It was still there. She had hidden it beneath a floorboard in the upstairs bedroom before leaving. The letters from Hattie were safe. The iron key was still on the table. But the visitor records, the partnership agreements, the financial projections, the documents that connected Everett Dane to the collapse of the project were gone. Margaret spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with every light in the house burning. She did not call the police. She did not call Frank. She sat and listened to the wind and thought about What kind of person would drive out to a farm in the middle of nowhere, break into a house, and steal 30-year-old paperwork? The answer was obvious. Someone who knew exactly what those papers contained and exactly what they could prove. At dawn, she walked the perimeter of the house. Near the back corner, where the ground was soft from recent rain, she found tire tracks fresh deep, made by a vehicle heavier than her own. They led down the access road and disappeared onto the county highway. She also found something else. Tucked beneath a stone on the front porch, weighted against the wind, was a single sheet of paper folded in half. No envelope, no name, no signature. The message was brief: stop looking, sell the property while you still can. Margaret read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her coat pocket, beside the iron key. She was afraid. She would not pretend otherwise. Her hands had not stopped trembling since the night before, and there was a tightness in her chest that made each breath feel slightly too small. She was 62 years old, alone on a property miles from the nearest neighbor, and someone had just made it very clear that her investigation was not welcome. But fear, she had learned long ago, was not the same as defeat. She had spent 31 years in school hallways where children vomited, fainted, seized, and bled, and she had never once left the room. She had held a 7-year-old's hand during an asthma attack so severe the paramedics later told her they were surprised the child had survived. She had learned that steadiness was not the absence of fear, but the decision to remain present inside it. She went back into the house, made coffee, and sat down at the table. Then she began to rebuild. She had copies, not of everything. The original partnership agreements were gone, the financial projections were gone, but she had photographed dozens of pages on her phone before the break-in, and the most important documents were still sealed in the cylinder beneath the bedroom floor. Ellis had his own records. Lorraine had the photograph. The story was not lost. It was only scattered, and scattering was something she understood how to reverse. Over the following days, a series of small, quiet events began to shift the landscape around her. Ellis appeared at the farm one morning with a box of his own files duplicates he had kept in his basement for decades, waiting for exactly this moment. He did not stay long. He set the box on the porch, looked at the house, and spoke without turning to face her. She built this to last. So did the records. June drove down from Syracuse with groceries, 2 space heaters, and a refusal to leave until the kitchen was properly cleaned. She did not ask about the documents or the break-in. She scrubbed the counters, stocked the refrigerator, replaced the broken latch on the back door, and told Margaret that the cafe in Ovid served a decent egg sandwich on Thursdays if she ever needed a reason to leave the house. Lorraine mailed a package photocopies of everything in Viola's box, along with a handwritten note that said simply, "Aunt V would have wanted you to have these." And one afternoon, when Margaret was examining the property line along the eastern edge of the farm, an old pickup truck pulled up to the gate. A man she did not recognize climbed out, walked halfway up the drive and set down a cardboard box without a word. Inside were 3 jars of honey, a folded quilt, and a note written in a child's handwriting. "Grandpa says your grandma was good to this town. Hope this helps." Margaret carried the box inside and placed the quilt over the back of the kitchen chair. She opened one of the jars of honey and ate a spoonful standing at the counter, and the sweetness of it made her eyes sting in a way she did not entirely understand. She was beginning to see something, not in the documents in the space around them. Hattie had not worked alone. She had built relationships with people in this community, people who remembered her, people who had benefited from her presence even if they did not know the full scope of what she had planned. And those relationships had survived decades of silence. They were still here, embedded in the soil of this place like root systems that continued to hold the earth together long after the plants above had disappeared. It was the following Tuesday when everything shifted again. Frank called in the evening. His voice was different, tighter, more controlled, as though he were managing something he didn't want to reveal. The conversation began with small talk, then moved to the farm, then narrowed to a single question, delivered with forced casualness. "Have you found anything else out there, anything that might have real value?" Margaret answered carefully. She mentioned the documents in general terms, but offered no specifics. Frank pressed harder. He mentioned that he had been speaking with a business associate who had experience in rural property development. The man had expressed interest in the Finger Lakes region and might be willing to visit the farm to offer an assessment free of charge as a favor. Margaret asked the man's name. Frank's answer came with the easy confidence of someone who has not yet realized he is being used. "Preston Dane, smart guy, knows the market inside out." The name landed in Margaret's stomach like a dropped stone. She said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then she told Frank that she was not interested in an assessment, that the property was not for sale, and that she would prefer he not share information about the farm with anyone outside the family. Frank's voice hardened. "Maggie, I'm trying to help you. You're sitting out there alone in a house that's falling apart, going through boxes of old paper like it means something. This man could actually do something useful with that land," she replied quietly. "The land is already doing something useful. You just can't see it yet." The call ended badly. 3 days later, a black SUV turned off the county highway and came up the access road to the farm. Margaret was standing on the porch when it arrived. She watched 2 men step out. One was Frank, who looked tired and slightly uncertain, as though he had committed to something and was no longer sure it had been the right decision. The other was a man she had never met, mid-50s, well-dressed, with a quality of physical ease that suggested he was accustomed to entering spaces and being welcomed in them. Preston Dane smiled as he approached. He extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief, calibrated to convey warmth without over-familiarity. He spoke about the beauty of the property, the potential of the region, the opportunities that existed for someone willing to think creatively about rural development. His words were smooth and practiced, and landed with the precision of stones placed carefully across a stream. Margaret listened without responding. She let him talk. She watched his eyes move across the land, the fields, the outbuildings, the ridge, and she recognized the look. It was not the look of a man appreciating something beautiful. It was the look of a man calculating what something was worth. When he finished, she spoke. Her voice was even neither hostile nor warm. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Dane, but this property isn't for sale. Not now, not to anyone." Preston's smile held, but something behind it shifted, a slight tightening around the jaw, a flicker in the eyes that lasted less than a second, but told her everything. He tried again. He mentioned market conditions, maintenance costs, tax obligations. He suggested gently that a property of this size was a significant burden for a single person, and that certain complications, legal, financial, structural, could arise if the situation was not managed properly. Margaret met his gaze and held it. "I've managed complications before." The visit ended shortly after. Preston shook her hand again at the car, and this time his grip lingered a fraction longer than necessary. He did not say anything threatening. He did not need to. The implication was there, folded neatly inside his politeness, like a blade wrapped in cloth. Frank stood by the passenger door, watching. He looked at Margaret, and for a moment she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not anger, not dismissal, but doubt. A hairline fracture running through the certainty he had carried since the reading of the will. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. He got into the car. Margaret stood on the porch and watched the SUV disappear down the access road. The dust it raised hung in the cold air for a long time before settling. She reached into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around the iron key. It was warm from her body, and its rough surface pressed against her palm like a word she could not yet pronounce. Behind her, the farmhouse creaked in the wind. Around her, 190 acres of silence stretched towards the lake and the hills and the sky. And somewhere out there, in an office in Albany, in a filing cabinet she had not yet found, in a conversation she had not yet overheard, the next piece of the story was already moving toward her, carrying with it a truth that would change not only what she understood about her grandmother's legacy, but what she understood about her own family, her own brother, and the kind of danger that wears a suit and smiles while it reaches for everything you love. The morning after, Preston Dane stood on her porch and smiled, while telling her all the ways her life could become difficult. Margaret woke before dawn and did something she had not done since arriving at the farm. She sat on the floor of the upstairs bedroom with every map Hattie had ever drawn and spread them in a wide circle around her like the petals of some enormous fading flower. There were 7 maps in total. They had been made at different times, she could tell by the paper, the ink, the slight evolution in Hattie's handwriting across the years. Each one showed the farm from a slightly different angle or at a slightly different scale, and each one contained small marks in red ink that she had noticed weeks ago but never examined closely enough. A dot here, a short line there, a tiny arrow pointing toward a feature she could not identify. Individually, the marks meant nothing, but now kneeling on the floor in the grey light, with all 7 maps arranged chronologically, she began to see what she had missed. The red marks, when overlaid in her mind, converged, not on the main house, not on the storehouse where she had found the cylinder, not on any structure she had already explored. They pointed toward a location at the far western edge of the property, behind a cluster of abandoned outbuildings she had walked past several times without stopping, near the base of a limestone bluff that rose above the tree line, like the spine of something buried. She traced the convergence point with her finger. Then she pulled out the original blueprints from the cornerstone documents and compared them to the most detailed of Hattie's maps. The blueprints showed a stone utility building at that location, 40 feet long, 20 feet wide. But the map showed dimensions that were larger, not dramatically, perhaps 8 feet deeper than what the blueprints indicated. 8 feet was enough. She dressed quickly, filled a thermos, and gathered the tools she had accumulated over the past weeks: a flashlight, a pry bar, work gloves, the iron key. She placed the key in her coat pocket, where it had lived since the first night, and she walked out into the cold. The walk took nearly an hour. The terrain was rougher at the western edge, where the land tilted upward toward the bluff, and the soil gave way to exposed rock. The outbuildings she had passed before looked even less significant in the early light: 3 low structures of rough-cut limestone, roofless, their interiors choked with fallen branches and the accumulated debris of years. She had assumed they were old storage sheds, unremarkable, not worth investigating. She entered the largest one. Inside, the walls were solid, despite the missing roof. The floor was a mix of packed earth and flat stones, laid in an uneven pattern. She paced the interior and compared it to the dimensions on the blueprint. The discrepancy was obvious now that she was looking for it. The building should have extended farther into the hillside, but the back wall appeared to end flush against the rock face. She spent 40 minutes examining that wall. She pressed stones, tested joints, ran her fingers along every seam. Nothing moved. Nothing clicked. She was beginning to doubt herself, beginning to wonder whether the maps had been imprecise, whether the red marks had been meaningless, whether she had simply wanted so badly to find something that she had invented a pattern where none existed. Then her glove caught on a ridge she had not felt before. A narrow lip of stone set slightly higher than the ones around it, along the bottom edge of the wall. She crouched and looked closer. The stone was not mortared in place. It was resting on a ledge held by gravity and friction alone. She used the pry bar. The stone shifted with a sound like a long exhale, and behind it she found a shallow recess containing a steel plate with a single keyhole at its center. Margaret reached into her pocket. The iron key slid in with a resistance that was almost gentle, as though the lock had been waiting and needed only a moment to remember. She turned it. A mechanism deep inside the wall released. With a sound she felt in her wrist, more than heard a heavy, definitive movement of metal against metal. A section of the wall swung inward, Beyond it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. She stood at the top for a long moment. The air rising from below was cool and dry, not the damp, decaying air of a forgotten basement, but something cleaner, something preserved. She turned on the flashlight and went down. The staircase was short 12 steps and opened into a room that made her stop and hold her breath. It was a vault, not large, perhaps the size of a generous bedroom, but engineered with a care that spoke of serious intention. The walls were poured concrete, sealed against moisture. Steel shelving lined 3 sides, and on every shelf stood filing boxes, binders, and rolled documents arranged in meticulous order. A metal desk occupied the center of the room, and on it sat a single box, wooden, unvarnished, the same size and shape as the one she had found behind the wardrobe weeks ago. Margaret moved through the room slowly, pulling boxes from shelves, opening binders, unrolling plans. What she found was staggering. This was the complete archive of the Cornerstone Initiative, not the fragments she had been piecing together, but the whole. Original contracts, engineering reports, economic models built across decades of research, letters from university departments, cooperative associations, and agricultural agencies confirming the viability of every element of the plan. Studies showing that the project was not only sound but urgently needed, and that its potential had only grown with time. And there was more. An entire shelf was devoted to documentation of the sabotage, correspondence between Everett Dane and 3 of the original partners, showing payments made in exchange for information, records of legal actions filed under false pretenses, evidence of documents deliberately destroyed, a detailed timeline written in Hattie's hand, tracing every step of the betrayal from its beginning to the moment she severed all contact and began hiding everything that remained. The evidence was thorough, it was dated, it was signed, and it was devastating. Margaret sat at the metal desk and placed her hands flat on its surface. She could feel the coldness of the steel through her palms, and she let herself stay there, breathing, letting the weight of the room settle around her. Then she opened the wooden box. Inside was a single envelope, her name on the front. Hattie's handwriting one last time. She opened it with hands that were no longer trembling. The letter was longer than any of the others. It began with warmth, a few sentences that read, the way Hattie's voice had always sounded on Sunday evenings, gentle and unhurried, as though time were a thing she had in abundance and was happy to share. She wrote about the farm, about the years she had spent building something she believed in, about the people she had worked with, and the people who had tried to take it all away. Then the letter turned. Hattie explained the will, not in legal terms, but in the language of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching her family and understanding each of them more clearly than they understood themselves. She had known exactly what would happen when the inheritance was read. She had known that Frank would feel validated, that the family would treat the money as the real prize, that Margaret would be pitied or ignored. She had designed it that way, not out of cruelty, out of certainty. The money, Hattie wrote, would find its way to whoever needed to feel important. That was what money did. It moved toward the loudest voice in the room. But the farm, the work, the records, the responsibility required something else entirely. It required someone willing to be patient, someone who would not be discouraged by appearances, someone capable of sitting with difficulty long enough to find what was hidden inside it. Margaret read the next lines 3 times before she could continue. "I did not leave you less, my dear girl. I left you everything that mattered. The others received what they could see. You received what they could not. And if you are reading this, then I was right about you. I was always right about you." She pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. The room was silent. The concrete walls held the cold and the quiet, and the faint smell of old paper and iron, and somewhere above her, beyond the stone and the earth and the bare winter trees, the world continued to turn without knowing what had just been uncovered. She did not cry, or perhaps she did briefly, in the way that grief and gratitude sometimes arrive at the same time and become indistinguishable. She stayed in the vault for several hours, cataloging, photographing, organizing. When she finally climbed the stairs and emerged into daylight, the sun was high, and the sky had cleared to a blue so sharp it seemed almost aggressive after the stillness below. She sealed the entrance and covered it carefully. That evening she scanned every critical document and sent copies to Ellis, to her attorney, and to a secure digital archive she had set up the week before. She was not going to lose this a second time. 9 days later, Frank arrived at the farm. He came alone. No attorney, no Preston Dane, no prepared arguments or rehearsed proposals. He pulled up in the late afternoon, parked crookedly, and sat in the car for several minutes before getting out. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window. She could see, even from that distance, that something had broken inside him, not catastrophically, but fundamentally, the way a bone breaks cleanly and must be set properly, or will never heal straight. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table without removing his coat. He looked at the documents spread across the surface, at the iron key resting beside the lamp, at the photographs tacked to the wall. He did not ask what any of it was. He already knew more than he wanted to. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Frank began to talk. He told her about the investments, the ones that had seemed so promising, the returns that never materialized, the projects that collapsed, the money that disappeared into accounts he could not trace. He told her about the meetings with Preston, the confidence, the reassurance, the way every loss was reframed as a temporary setback, and every risk was presented as an opportunity. He told her about the night he finally sat down and followed the money himself, line by line, account by account, until he found something he could not explain: transfers routed through companies that did not appear to exist, fees paid to entities whose addresses led to empty offices, and at the center of it all, a web of connections that led back to the same family name, Dane. His voice cracked, not dramatically, but in the small, private way that men of his generation allow themselves to crack a single fault line running through a sentence that he otherwise delivered with the composure of someone reporting a fact. I think he was using me from the beginning. I think all of it. Every meeting, every handshake, every piece of advice was about getting closer to this place. Margaret did not respond immediately. She reached across the table and placed a folder in front of him, the evidence from the vault. Everett Dane's letters, the payment records, the timeline of betrayal, the documentation that proved the destruction of the original project had been deliberate, coordinated, and driven by a single family's ambition across 2 generations. Frank read in silence, page after page. His face changed as he went, first confusion, then recognition, then something deeper and harder to name, something that lives in the space between shame and understanding. When he finished, he set the folder down and pressed both hands against the table, as though steadying himself against a current only he could feel. His voice was barely audible, I thought. I got the better deal. I thought you got nothing. And the whole time he stopped. He looked at her. His eyes were red and his jaw was tight, and in that moment he looked nothing like the man who had adjusted his tie at the reading of the will and told her to call a realtor. He looked like her brother. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. They sat like that for a long time, while the light changed in the kitchen and the shadows of the window frame moved slowly across the floor. Neither of them said the word forgiveness. Neither of them needed to. Some things are communicated more precisely through the weight of a hand on a table and the willingness to stay seated when it would be easier to leave. The months that followed moved at the pace of seasons. Margaret filed the evidence with the appropriate authorities. Investigations opened. Preston Dane's network of shell companies and redirected investments began to unravel under scrutiny that he had never expected to face. He fought back, of course, through lawyers, through intermediaries, through carefully worded denials, but the documents were too complete, too meticulously preserved. Hattie had spent decades preparing for exactly this, and her preparation held. Frank returned to the farm the following week, and the week after that, and the week after that. At first he came to help with repairs, patching the roof clearing brush from the access road, replacing windows that had been broken for years. He did not talk much during those early visits. He worked with his hands and let the labor say what he could not. Gradually his role expanded. He understood contracts, he understood negotiations, he understood how to speak with investors and partners and government officials in the language they expected, and he put those skills to use, not for himself this time, but for the project. Margaret contacted agricultural specialists, community development organizations, and cooperative networks across the region. She presented them with the Cornerstone Initiative, not as a relic, but as a living plan, updated and adapted for the present. The response was cautious at first, then curious, then enthusiastic. The core of Hattie's vision: employment, training, local food systems, cooperative economics addressed problems that had only deepened in the decades since she had first identified them. Ellis watched from a respectful distance. He offered advice when asked, and silence when it was more useful. One afternoon, standing at the edge of a field where the first cover crop had been planted, he looked out at the green just beginning to push through the soil and spoke without turning around. She would have liked this, not because it's finished, because it's started. People came, not all at once, but steadily, the way water returns to a dry stream bed, first a trickle, then a current. Families from the surrounding towns attended information sessions. Young farmers who had been ready to leave the region found reasons to stay. A cooperative market opened in Ovid, using a building that had been vacant for 6 years. A training program launched in partnership with the County Extension Service, and its first cohort included 14 people whose parents had left the area a generation ago and who had returned because they heard something was happening on the old Lennox farm, something that sounded for the first time in a long time like a future. The honeyman came back. He brought his granddaughter, this time the one who had written the note, in a child's handwriting. She was 9 years old. She walked through the restored barn with wide eyes and asked Margaret if it was true that one person had saved this whole place. Margaret knelt so she was level with the girl's face and answered honestly, no. One person started looking, then other people helped. That's how it works. On an evening in late spring, Margaret walked alone to the top of the ridge above the farm. The air was warm for the first time since she had arrived, and it carried the smell of turned earth and wild apple blossoms and the faint green sweetness of new growth. Below her the property spread out in every direction, fields planted and fallow buildings repaired, and still waiting paths cleared through land that had been impassable 6 months ago. She could see workers finishing for the day, loading tools into trucks, calling to each other across the yard. She could hear a tractor engine fading as it moved along the far fence line. A light came on in the barn where the training sessions were held, and through the open doors she could see chairs being arranged in rows for the evening meeting. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the iron key. It was warm. It had been warm every time she held it, from the heat of her body, from the habit of carrying it, from the countless times she had closed her fingers around it in moments when she did not know what came next and needed something solid to hold. She did not need it any more, not for locks. Everything it had been made to open had been opened, but she held it anyway, turning it slowly in her palm, feeling the rough surface that some unknown hand had shaped over a forge decades or perhaps a century ago. And she thought about the woman who had placed it in a wooden box behind a hidden door in a house that everyone believed was worthless. Hattie had not left her money. She had not left her comfort or certainty or an easy path. She had left her a question and trusted that Margaret would not stop asking it until she found the answer. The sun was low now, coloring the lake in the distance with shades of copper and rose. The wind moved through the new grass in long, slow waves that caught the light and released it, caught it and released it as though the land itself were breathing. Margaret closed her hand around the key and held it against her chest. Some inheritances look like nothing when you first receive them. Some look like burdens, like mistakes, like proof that you were valued less than someone else. But the truth is that the most important things we are given rarely arrive in forms we recognize. They arrive as questions, as difficulty, as land that everyone else has abandoned, and they wait patiently, quietly in the dark for someone willing to get down on their knees and dig. The roots run deeper than anyone remembers. And sometimes, if you are patient enough to follow them all the way down, you discover that they were holding up everything all along. Now, before you go, we want to ask you something. Is there something in your life that once looked like a burden, something that everyone else told you to let go of, but that turned out to be the most important thing you ever held on to? We'd love to hear about it in the comments. We read every one. Thank you for spending this evening with Margaret. Sleep well. Good night.